Dr. Annie Zimmerman is a psychotherapist, as I mentioned, and a TikTok personality as well as Instagram personality. I am so familiar with all of her videos and I love to watch. Dr. Annie is working with clients for from a psychodynamic approach. She has a PhD in psychology, and her expertise centers on teaching clients how their early lives have formed strategies that might be contributing to unhelpful patterns in adulthood. Currently, she lives in London, where she has a thriving private practice. And as I mentioned, you can follow Dr. Annie on TikTok and on Instagram as your pocket therapist. Okay, so I have so many questions, and we are going to go ahead and dive in. And first, I just want to understand a little bit about you, why you became a psychotherapist. So the first question for you is, what inspired you to become a psychotherapist and focus on helping individuals navigate personal growth and relinquish trauma?
I think, like many therapists, I experienced the benefits of therapy firsthand. I mean, therapy, I write about this in the book, completely changed my life in ways I didn't even realize that it could be changed or it should be changed. I come from a family of therapists. My mum is a therapist, all my aunties are therapists, my sister is a therapist, every woman in my family, cousins, everything, they're all therapists. So you'd think that, it's kind of like I would understand that therapy is really powerful and it's important, but it really wasn't until going through it myself and like experiencing the profound change in areas that I was seeking help, or that also areas that I didn't even consider were problems until I started opening things up and talking about it. And I found this so incredible that therapy can be this tool and have this much of an impact and like a long-term impact over your life, that I really wanted to be able to offer that to other people. And yeah, that's been what's motivated me really through all the training and setting up the Instagram and the TikTok and writing the book. It's all about kind of sharing this revelation with people so that they too can have their lives changed.
I love that. One, it is incredible that you come from a family of therapists and that you followed in the same footsteps and that you enjoyed it. I feel like you rarely ever hear that. And also it's you also did the work and you got to experience it. So when you share, with your clients, it's a very different interaction, I'm assuming, right? Because you got to experience the work for yourself. And so we're going to talk a lot about like negative patterns, right? And how they affect our lives, and keep us really from happiness, right? So what are the most negative patterns that people struggle with, and where do they stem from?
I think everybody kind of suffers differently, but fundamentally, I think the trap that most of us fall into is unconsciously repeating things from our past without even realizing or having an understanding, but not knowing how to change that. So often, when something has not gone too well in your childhood, we can call this trauma or just anything negative that happens in childhood. Our mind goes to repeat this so that we can in a warped way, we're trying to heal what's happened in the past by going for the same sort of situation in our present day. And we do this trying to kind of change the story, change the narrative, like this time things will be different, but of course we end up just repeating and ending up in the same type of situation. So I'd say this happens a lot in relationships. We might go for people who are just like, our father, who was avoidant and didn't engage with us emotionally or was quite critical. And even though we might consciously go looking for something different, we end up attracted to the same patterns, and then we respond like in the same way from that kind of child place rather than being able to grow. And I think without conscious awareness, most of us kind of just spend our lives repeating these patterns, and then we suffer and we struggle and we go through the same cycles of pain over and over again without change. And that's where a lot of people end up going to therapy, because they want that moment of change.
So you talked about relationships. We're going to get there in a bit because I know that your childhood and your trauma affects different types of relationships. Um, and you just brought up conscious awareness self. So when you realize, I mean, how do you identify these patterns, right? Like, what questions do you ask yourself? And like, what is the first step? What happens when you realize that you have a pattern? And,
Yeah, it's a great question. My whole like one of the buzzwords that I use is curiosity. So get curious is the first step that I talk about in the book, as if you want to change something in your life, anything, the first thing that you can do and the best thing that you can do is just be curious. So instead of judging yourself, like, oh, why did I have a panic attack, or why do I keep dating the same person, that kind of critical question doesn't actually open up any self-awareness. It just shames us and judges us, and we might try to do things differently, but ultimately we're not understanding the problem. So approaching with like a gentle curiosity, I think, is so important. Like, what is this pattern? Like, what am I getting from this pattern? Because even though it's causing me pain, I keep choosing it, I keep doing it. So it's clearly serving some sort of function. And I think having that kind of, like, I talk about this as playing detective. In a way, a therapist is a bit like a detective. So, when someone comes through my door, I don't really know. I don't, people think therapists have all the magic answers, but I don't know what's going on really. I have questions that help us together to explore. Um, so it's about playing detective and looking for signs, looking for reasons, looking for things that have happened in the past that might help to explain what's happening today. And I think we can do this for ourselves just by always staying curious. So anytime that you have a reaction that confuses you, or you're like, okay, I overreacted, why? Or I'm not sleeping, what's going on? Or like, why do I feel so low? Just really curiously explore, okay, what happened today? What might be going on in my life? Where might this be coming from? Where have I felt this before? What's familiar about this? How am I responding in a way that might be similar to how a child part of me? And I think just really opening things up instead of judging and shaming would be the first step.
So before I ask, like, what do you do once you play detective and you ask yourself these questions and you identify these answers, what happens though, like, if you start to ask yourself these questions and you can't make sense of the responses or the answers that you're getting?
Yeah, I mean, this is why doing it kind of in relationship with a therapist is really helpful, because they
Right.
can help you. And often they might have a perspective that you're too close to it to see, or they notice something that you are just, we all have blind spots you're just not really aware of. So I think that's really important. But I think just being kind with yourself, and you're not going to figure it all out immediately. So if there's something that confuses you or you don't have an immediate answer for, that's okay, and just kind of put a pin in it and keep it in mind, and answers might become clear later on as you start thinking about something completely different. And this is the beauty of therapy, really. You start talking about something that feels unrelated, and it ends up being like a perfect analogy for what's going on in your life, or it ends up bringing you to a memory that you're still having an emotional response to, that is similar to the pattern in your life, for example.
I know that I said I wanted to stick to the script, but I have like so many questions with everything that you're saying. Okay, so I'm going to move on with the questions that we have. And so you talked about playing detective. So what are some practical tools, right? Like, what happens next? Like I said, after you figure out the answers to these questions, then what are the next steps? And I think like something else that I really want to highlight is that you're talking about being kind to yourself. And I feel like we struggle so much, right? Like giving ourselves grace, having self-compassion and kindness. Like, as we go through these, through the different phases, right? Once we get this information, I guess, like, what are some ways as well that we can stay in that space of kindness and self-compassion with ourselves?
Yeah, I think really recognizing that we all have, it's really easy to love the parts of yourself that are socially acceptable, but we all have a shadow side, which are the parts of yourself that you're ashamed of, the parts of yourself that society tells you are wrong. So let's take a pretty kind of gendered example, that women shouldn't be angry and men shouldn't be sad or emotional. It's really the real struggle to kind of love yourself and be kind to yourself is in loving those things that society or your parents or your peers or somewhere along the way you've been told is wrong and that you shouldn't be like that. So I think it's really about embracing what we call the shadow self, which is really, your negative feelings, the ugly parts of you, the messy parts of you that we all have as part of the human experience. No one is perfect and good. And I think once we can accept that, that we all sometimes feel really jealous, or we all have the capacity to get angry or to be selfish, all of these things. It means that knowing that going in means that we can kind of come in, we can preempt the self-criticism, because it's like, instead of just being harsh on yourself about it, accepting that it's there in the first place means that we don't have to have such like an internal battle with ourselves to prove to ourselves that we're really, really good, which all that does is shames us for having any sort of negative feelings or reactions.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so as I said, we were going to talk about the relationships, right? So can we talk about, before we get into relationships, can we talk about some of these very common patterns that you've seen, you know, the most common patterns that you've seen that show up in people, and then how do they show up in in relationships? And this is where I feel like I'm going to have so much to say.
So I think there's a common experience where we choose people who are similar to our parents, which is, that will be really individual based on the kind of parents that you had or the kind of caregivers that you have. But within that, it's often about kind of attachment style and the polarities in attachment style. So for example, if you are anxiously attached, it's likely that you might have had an avoidant caregiver. And then going into adult relationships, you might be more attracted to avoidantly attached people. And then we end up in that kind of anxious avoidant dance where you're chasing and they're pulling away and you feel crazy and why don't they like me, and then you break up and then the avoidant comes closer, and it's like a really common dynamic, and actually that tends to come from our patterns in childhood. But other patterns will be just the way that we communicate. We learn, we're so moldable when we're young, and we learn about how to express love, how to express anger, how to fight, how to deal with our feelings, and whether we show our feelings or we don't talk about our feelings. All of that is defined in your childhood, which doesn't mean it can't change, but it does mean that we're more likely, if we don't do work on ourselves and bring awareness to all of this, we're more likely to just kind of repeat our childhood and repeat the ways that were taught to us, even if they're not the most beneficial for us. And this is all about relationships, because even just observing your parents' relationships, whether they were together or not, whether they showed love and passion, or whether they were angry, or whether they just didn't talk, or whether they were friends, like all of this is going to create a blueprint for how we see relationships. And even if we don't want to become like our parents, we often end up finding ourselves there anyway. So I think it's quite general, because everybody has different like specific kind of parents, but what tends to happen is it's the way we communicate, or the way we love, or the expectations that we have of what a partner does.
Does these relationships also that we have, in our childhoods, do they attract specific people? So like, for example, do these relationships that we have, that we grew up with, and these attachments, do we attract a specific kind of partner? Do we attract specific types of friends? Like, how does that affect? I know that people talk a lot about like what we attract, right? And like, if you're emotionally unavailable, then that's what you're going to attract. Is there any truth in that? How does that work? And can you break away from that? Like, that is a pattern in itself. How can you break away from that pattern?
Yeah, I think it does change who we attract, because a securely attached person who's kind of the gold standard, who is able to set boundaries and be intimate and close without losing themselves, they are going to see certain types of behavior and lose attraction, because they're going to think, I don't want that's too messy, or that seems toxic, or whatever. So I think the way that we show up, the way that we express ourselves, the energy that we give off, a lot of this is unconscious as well, that we're not even aware of, really can attract in the wrong or the right kind of person. So yeah, this idea that we need to kind of love ourselves before we can love someone else, although I think we do heal in relationships. I don't think you learn to love yourself in isolation and then suddenly you're ready for a relationship. But I do think some level of work is needed to be done in order to attract and be attracted to a healthy partner.
I love that you just mentioned the healing by yourself versus healing in a relationship, right? Is there a level of healing that you should do on your own, and what type of healing is that before you could or you should enter a relationship?
I mean, what I often see happen is people heal kind of through the stages of different relationships. So you have a partner, you're really young maybe at this time, and you don't even know what you're doing, and then you see some traits in yourself and them and some patterns you don't like, and you break up and you start to work on them, and then you meet someone else and they bring up new patterns and new triggers, and you kind of evolve through the relationships and the periods of being single and being on your own and learning from the breakup. And I don't think there's kind of one way to do it to heal. Some people might meet their perfect person when they're young, and they're able to grow together and do that work together, whereas other people might find relationships really difficult and need time on their own, just to kind of gather themselves and to understand what it is that's going wrong. So yeah, I think Instagram therapy kind of gives you a blanket rule for everyone, and it's just not the case. There's no right way to be in a relationship, and there's no right way to heal.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if you start looking online, there's so many different ideals of what you should do, right? And so many of them are opposing. So it's really confusing on what is right, what you should listen to, what you should follow. So I guess we know that, once you start to heal, right? Like that's when you start to feel happiness, when you start to break away from these patterns. But that's the problem, like, doing that work, right? Wanting to face, you acknowledge these patterns and then wanting to do that work to break free from them. So what are some of the biggest challenges that people face when breaking away from these patterns?
Yeah, I think what can happen is we tend to have an understanding before we actually can change them. So most of us quite quickly realize, oh, this pattern is familiar, this feeling, this situation, this feeling is familiar, but knowing that isn't enough to change it. And again, this is one of the 5 steps I talk about in the book, that once you understand, once you've been curious and you understand where the pattern is coming from, and you've thought about your life experiences and everything, you can't just stop there. You then have to process the original wound or multiple wounds, and that involves really connecting to the feelings, and allowing yourself to feel the pain of things that have happened to you, or disappointments or grief or anger or whatever it might be. And that's what it means to process. It's not just, oh, I understand, my parents were like this and therefore I'm doing this in my relationships now. Otherwise therapy would take one session and the therapist would just say, you're repeating, and you'd say, oh yeah, I'll stop that now. It's so much more work than that, because there's a part of you that really doesn't want to change. And I think this is something, again, that's kind of missold on Insta therapy and TikTok therapy, is that we're really resistant as humans to change, because we're afraid of our brains and our minds are designed to feel safe, and we experience familiarity as safety. So choosing something different from what we've known, even if it's us acting differently or choosing a different situation or partner, it feels terrifying. And so it can be a real challenge to actually get to that moment where you act. Then yeah, step 4 in the 5 steps is to really act on this. So you've got curious, you've understood, you've felt through the painful feelings and are starting to process things, and then you have to do something differently. And this is where so many people get stuck. You have to really challenge your patterns, challenge who you're attracted to or how you tend to respond to things. And this takes a lot of time, because inevitably we fall back into the old way of being, and then we have to recognize that, understand what's happening, process it, and then try again to be different. And this is how we grow. But there can be definitely moments where part of us doesn't really want to.
You say that's the most challenging step and where people get stuck. What are some ways that people can get unstuck? Like what are some tips that you can provide for folks that are stuck?
Mm-hmm. I mean, feeling the fear and doing it anyway is a quote that I love. Even we've all heard it, but it's really true, that the fear of change is never as scary as we think it's going to be. And often it brings so much growth and so many new things and positive things in our life if we can just wade through that initial fear of being different and showing up differently. And then just being really conscious, being really aware. So if you're aware of a pattern, consciously choose something different and see what that's like. So, if you tend to like date bad boys, as an example, you tend to date the emotionally unavailable people who aren't that nice, or ghost you or string you along. And you feel that you're not that attracted to the nice guys. People who are too nice and too keen put you off. Like, challenge yourself to lean into that and to really consciously choose something different from what you're used to. I don't mean force attraction and go out with someone who you're not attracted to, but just explore different options and feel it out and see what it is that's coming up that's so difficult about being with someone who does actually choose you. Inspiration, and you're not kind of criticizing yourself into trying to change. It's more about like being expansive and encouraging yourself to grow in ways that you might not realize.
We just talked a lot about the fear of changing, right? I find that a lot of people, and I could be wrong based on, your practice, but a lot of people are so afraid to look inward, right? Like asking yourself the questions, right? Okay, you realize there's this pattern. Okay, you have that self-awareness. And then it's that fear of, once I start peeling that onion, what's going to come up? Why is it that people are so afraid? I guess, to lack of a better word, or term, peel the onion, right? Because it really is like peeling an onion. And just like you were saying, it's like you delve into one thing, something that came up for you, and then it leads you down a completely different path.
I think we're terrified of things that we think that other people won't accept, that we'll get rejected for. Like, a lot of it comes down to that fear of abandonment and fear of that we're not good or that we're unlovable by somebody else. So I think often what we're afraid of is a part of ourselves that, like, we think will make people not like us or not, or leave us. And so we bury them out of sight of other people, but then even out of sight of ourselves, to the point where we don't even realize that we're repressing our feelings or our fears or our memories or whatever it might be. So I think that's again one of the magical things about therapy, is you show yourself to someone and they stay. They're still here next week, even though you admitted to them your darkest fears or something terrible that happened to you, or you cried really ugly cried for half an hour. They stay and they witness it, and they kind of, just by being there, they're saying, you're okay, you haven't broken me, you haven't scared me off, I'm not going to leave you because you've been vulnerable. And that's the true fear of vulnerability, is that other people won't be able to handle it. They will, it will mean something bad about us, that other people won't want us. And when we experience that profound feeling of being vulnerable and someone else still loves us, then we can accept ourselves, because we're like, oh, this isn't terrible. We're still lovable. Some people are still here, even though we've shown this. And that's like a lesson that happens, like, not even on a conscious level, but really, really on a really deep level.
So we've just talked a lot about, the process, right? The 5 steps, as you mentioned. And obviously this conversation is about unlocking happiness. So what is the impact of going through this process, through going through these steps, right? What is that feeling that you're going to have? Let's talk about happiness. What does that feel like? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I guess happiness is a feeling. I think one of the keys to unlocking happiness is to stop trying to be happy, to accept that you're a human who is going to have like 500 different feelings within one day, and one of them might be happy, but accepting all of the different parts of you is going to make you like put less pressure on yourself when you're having a bad day or when things aren't going right. So I think, yeah, embracing the full spectrum of emotion, and not trying to cling on to happiness or try to repeat moments where you felt good, because everything's always shifting. But I guess, the aim really is contentment, is to be happy with your life where you're at, you know, the choices you've made, where you're at in your career and your family and your life and your relationships. And I think that is about really noticing the areas which aren't bringing you joy, where you're not content, and delving into your own responsibility of why you got there, why you're stuck there, and what you can do to change it. So it's so easy for us to blame the external forces and to feel like we have no power in our lives. And often, you know, situations are really complicated and it's not so easy as just clicking your fingers and getting what you want, but really trying to feel that empowerment of like, oh, I can change this. Like I can actually do something about this. Because like once you realize that you're creating your world and a lot of where you're at is because of you, even though that's kind of you know, you have to swallow humble pie a bit and look at difficult parts, but it's also really empowering because then you can change those things. Like you're choosing it and therefore you can change it. And I think, yeah, having that responsibility can help you feel a bit more in control of your life.
I love that you just said that, like you can change it, because I can't tell you how many times I hear people will say to me, happiness is a choice. You know, you choose whether or not you want to be happy. And it's like, but it's not that simple. I mean, like, who doesn't want to be happy, right? Like, of course I want to be happy. But when you're telling, like, I don't get to choose between being happy and being sad, it doesn't really work that way, you know? And I guess, like, how do you, when you do feel powerless, right, or overwhelmed, like, what are some practices or some tips that you can, that you can offer, that you can get yourself back into that space again, where you can get back on track, or seek that happiness, you know?
Yeah, well, I think there are practical things you can do to kind of ground yourself, whether that's meditation or just you know, body awareness, like feeling your feet on the ground and your body in the chair and just like slowing everything down with your breathing. But then on a kind of deeper level, I think it's about like getting to the point of recognizing what you can do, because that feeling of overwhelm and stress is like, it's all happening to me and it's all outside of me and there's nothing I can do, and you feel out of control and like really anxious. And just small things that you can do and that you do have power over can make you feel that bit more in control and that bit more kind of grounded with everything.
Something that really works for me that I started doing recently has been breath work.
Mm.
And it's been magical. I mean, I did it before this event just to make sure that I was grounded. Something that I wanted to add was this is obviously, like, it's not like this is going to happen overnight, right? Like, this is going to take time. So it's like you establish a pattern. Um, I guess, like, what are some steps that you can work on every day, right? Like, what are some things that you can do every day to actively work on breaking these patterns, and having that self-empowerment and self-confidence, and finding joy again, in life.
Yeah, I really like that you kind of said it's going to take time. It kind of brings me very nicely through like the fifth point of the fifth step from my book, that is repeat. And that is just acknowledging that like this whole thing is going to take so much repetition, because you're creating new neural pathways in your brain every time you change, but the old ones are the more dominant ones. So you have to go again and again and again through the new ones until your brain learns, okay, this is the new way we're doing things. So just acknowledging and respecting that this is going to take time. You're not going to fix everything overnight. There's no magic pill. But what you can do is just keep repeating these small steps and keep going through these changes, and eventually they'll lead to bigger changes. But every day, I think things that can help are, if you can't access a therapist or some sort of therapeutic group, journaling. I know lots of people find that so helpful, just to get their thoughts out. And again, that really helps with the curiosity, because you're like, oh, I was saying the same thing a few months ago. Oh, wow, the way I'm talking to myself has really changed. And like having it in writing can really like help you to mark things and to bring awareness to common themes that are coming up. Yeah, tools like breath work, meditation, any sort of body awareness. Again, it's all about getting to know yourself, but on like a physical level, and getting more comfortable with difficult feelings. um and yeah, I think also giving yourself breaks for joy. I think a lot of us who are doing healing and are doing therapy, it can always feel like it has to all be hard work, but sometimes you just want to switch music on and dance, or go out with
That's
your
me.
friends. Right. It's all of us. It becomes like something we hit ourselves over the head with, like, oh God, I haven't done my yoga today and I'm a bad person. Like sometimes it's about just putting all of the routines and the structures away and just giving ourselves a break to enjoy life, which is predominantly, I think, what life is supposed to be about.
I want to ask, so how can we support friends or people in our lives, right? Whether it's a romantic partner, whether it's a family member or a friend in our life that is going through, these 5 steps that we talked about, right? That is or hasn't even started yet, right? Like doesn't even have the awareness yet, but that we see that they're stuck in a pattern. How can we support them? How can we help them? Like, what is a way that we can bring it up to them, right? Without hurting them or making them feel like they're doing something wrong or overwhelming them or scaring them. Like, what advice would you have?
I would say to kind of lead with your own vulnerability, so that they don't feel attacked or criticized or shamed into, you know, anything. Just staying with how you feel is really important. If you're raising something with them that's difficult, just like, this is how this has made me feel. How can we talk about this together? But in terms of like supporting someone on their journey, I honestly think we underestimate just the power of being there and listening. A lot of people struggle when someone else is in distress. They're like, I don't know what to say, and I feel like I need to offer a solution or the perfect sentence that's going to like fix everything, and we can't. All we can do is be there and hold them, emotionally, and even just by being like, I understand, or like, what do you need from me, rather than trying to solve everything and feeling, yeah, anxious in our minds about what we're going to say. Just being there and listening is the biggest support we can give people. Plus, yeah, being vulnerable ourselves and modeling that sense of openness and vulnerability, so that another person feels safe enough to do the same.
So I'm asking for a friend. So how do you hold space for someone when you're on your own healing journey, right? And doing your own healing, and they yet haven't started their healing, but it's like you're saying, right? It's showing up, it's modeling that behavior, right? What that looks like. How can you hold space for both, and not let where they are affect your own healing journey? Again, asking for a friend.
Well, I think it will affect your healing journey, and like, maybe it's okay to be affected. um and knowing that you can hold yourself through that. And it can be really frustrating when someone else isn't in the same place as you, or when they don't want to engage in the same way as you. But I think really respecting your lack of control over others, like, all you can do is show up differently for yourself and hope that they witness that and are inspired and are curious about how you've done that, and are able to change. But like, really just like, yeah, accepting how much we can't change other people, and we can't do the work for them, but we can only be there and, set boundaries where things aren't changing.
Thank you. Really quickly, if you can just recap the 5 steps again that you talk about in your book for everyone, in case they might have joined late or they missed it, because this is really important. This is the nitty-gritty stuff that we all need.
Totally, yeah. So the 5 steps are to get curious, which is all of that asking why, what's happening, where did this come from, when did it start, what might be going on, and just letting kind of whatever comes up come up. Second is to understand, which by this I mean kind of mapping back through your childhood and really understanding how you came to be, what things impacted you, and how they might be showing up in your present. Number 3 is to feel. So not just staying in our heads, not just intellectualizing, but really connecting to these past things and these present things, letting ourselves feel, all the uncomfortable, difficult feelings that we might have been pushing down. Number 4 is to act, which is, crystallizing all of this into action, into really doing something differently, whether that's, in our work lives, in procrastination, in a relationship. It's responding differently to how we would have before, and really pushing ourselves to get unstuck. And then number 5 is to repeat. So again, these 5 steps are not linear. They happen differently over different times for every person. So there's, you might start off with loads of feelings and then have to go back and understand where they've come from. Or you might, go through and get really stuck on one of them for a while and have to repeat and repeat the same questions. And that's absolutely part of it. So just accepting the process might take a while, and it's never going to be kind of fully completed, but knowing that you're going to kind of evolve over different cycles.
Thank you. Thank you for that recap. We have a ton of questions and we're going to go into them in 1 second, but one last question that I have for you. You shared a lot of information, great information, but I feel like if you're someone that is starting with the self-awareness, it's a lot, right? So like, what piece of advice can you give to someone? What can they just really quickly, anything that they can take and just start implementing immediately, after listening to everything that you just shared?
Yeah, I think that would be that, like, everything that's happened to you was not your decision, but how you are in your life right now is your choice. And that's not meant to blame you for anything that's happened to you, but meant to empower you to know that you are choosing these things and therefore you can change them, and to hold that as something that's really empowering, that you don't have to be a victim of life, you don't have to suffer in this way. There is room for change, and change is possible for everyone. And I think that that's a really powerful statement to hold.
It is, and it's so beautiful, right? Because you're not to blame, so you don't have to carry that with you, and you do have the power, which is so beautiful, because so often we're powerless, right? Or have felt powerless. And the things that happen to us really were out of our control. So knowing that we have the power now, and how they continue to affect us in our lives, right? Thank you so much for everything that you shared. Before we dive into the Q&A, and I hope I didn't ask too many questions for my friends. Before we dive into the Q&A, I really quickly wanted to share a slide on your book so that you can share a little bit about your book for everyone that wants to learn more about everything you had to say about the 5 steps. There's more detail on the book. And then we're also going to share, again, a link in the chat for anyone that would like to purchase Dr. Annie's book. The link is in the chat, and we're going to put up a slide on the book so that Dr. Annie can just give us a quick recap on the book, so that for anyone that's interested, they can go ahead and purchase the book.
Thanks. Yeah, so this is Your Pocket Therapist, which is the name of my Instagram and TikTok, and also the name of my first book. And it's split up into 2 halves. So there's self and relationships. And it's all about implementing these 5 steps in the therapeutic process. And I give examples of people going through therapy and how they actually change. So it's split up into really short chapters, like it's very pockety, lots of exercises and bullet points and stories and examples. So we go through like anxiety, self-criticism, addiction, depression, procrastination, and then we move through to different relationship struggles. So we go all the way from dating through to breakups and the full right relationship and attachment theory, and why we choose emotionally unavailable people and when to walk away, all of these big questions that people have, and how to work through them.
Thank you, Dr. Annie. Okay, we are going to go ahead and dive into the questions because we have so many. And thank you, everyone, for sharing your questions. Again, we encourage you to submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Okay. First question is from Aaron. I feel myself that I'm staying safe and not taking the steps to pursue my deeper passions and purpose. How do I overcome this pattern of staying within fear?
Yeah, so this is really what I was talking about when we're so afraid of change, that it can feel like change equals danger. But actually, I think there's nothing more dangerous than staying stuck. There's nothing more dangerous than not pursuing your passion and your purpose. So if you recognize that that's actually a scarier place to be than the unknown, and even if the unknown is scary, it might also be really fruitful. You don't know. So I think it's about working through what it is you're actually afraid of. Like, are you actually afraid of fulfilling your purpose and passion? Maybe you're afraid of succeeding, afraid of getting what you want, afraid of who you will be, and the losses and the changes that it would mean for your life. So really, like, yeah, it's getting curious about what that fear is about. And then I think change happens in the small moment. So it's like dipping your toe in the water. So you know, what happens if you make one small shift and realize, oh, okay, that actually wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. Can I make a slightly bigger one? And then hopefully over time, whatever those passions and that purpose that you're talking about won't feel so big and so far away, and you'll take those small steps to get there. So but you know, I think you'll get to this moment of like, all right, it's make or break now, and hopefully be able to embrace the things that you're afraid of.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions about feeling your feelings and grieving. Someone says, how can you feel your feelings? I've been told that I never grieve things, but I never stopped grieving. Is there a way to grieve? And I feel like there's so many questions about feeling your feelings and how do you do that? What does that feel like? How do you let them go? What does grieving feel like?
Yeah, I think one of the difficult things about feeling your feelings is that you don't know when you're not feeling them. So when we repress feelings, we don't really know that we're doing it. It happens completely unconsciously. So we're not aware. And that can make it really difficult because people are like, well, I'm feeling everything I'm feeling, but they're not even aware of how much they are not in their body. So I think feeling your feelings is really about letting yourself be in your body. So it's like not being distracted. Don't scroll, don't binge eat, don't drink, don't go to all those vices that take you away from your feelings, and just see what comes up. This is a tool called urge surfing, which is like, it's generally about addictive behaviors, but you can use it for anything where you realize, hang on a sec, I'm distracting myself from my feelings. And just seeing, okay, what will happen if I let myself experience the discomfort? Like, what if I don't pick up my phone to start scrolling when I want to? Like, what happens here? And just like letting your body become a place that you allow whatever comes up to come up. And in terms of grief, I think that's one of the things that we struggle with so much, especially when processing the past. We have to really grieve for what we didn't get in order to stop looking for it in other people as an adult. And that means going through a process of mourning and being like, I am never going to get my childhood back. I am never going to get the perfect people that I needed when I was a child. And that's irrevocably changed me. And I don't think there's a right way to grieve. I don't even think this is something that we can force. I think it kind of comes in waves, and really it's about allowing yourself to talk about it and to be really honest with how these things have affected you. And again, allowing the discomfort in your body, allowing whatever those feelings are. And grief looks different for everyone. Some people need to cry for years in therapy. Other people need to learn to get really angry and smash stuff and release their anger. Some people need both, and it comes at different over many years, at different times. So I don't think, yeah, we shouldn't be thinking, am I doing this right, and am I grieving correct? It's really just staying open and seeing what comes up.
How do you know when you're done grieving?
I don't think you're ever done. I don't think any of these things are like you can suddenly, you know, tick a box and like, right, finished now. But I think you start to move on. So I know when people start therapy, you can get really obsessed with things that have happened to you, because you're finally talking about them, you're finally giving them a voice. And you might stay stuck on them for years, and this is processing. And then you get to a point where you're like, okay, suddenly I'm finding myself talking about new things, and I don't need to tell those same stories anymore. And the changes kind of happen, without us like forcing them. So I think, yeah, how do we know when we're done? Our mind starts to be filled with new things, and we have more space for new things. I would say that doesn't mean, you can always start talking about these things and feel sad again, but you're more kind of like, you're more built up for the future.
Okay, what about people who actively avoid relationships for fear of being hurt or abused yet again? How do we heal and how do we protect ourselves so we can move on? This was from Anonymous.
Yeah, I think it can be so hard to have relationships if you've come from trauma. Just recognizing that you expect on some level, whether you're aware of it or you're not, for this to happen again. And that can make getting close to someone, even though that's probably something you really want, it also is so scary. And we often sabotage relationships because of that fear. Recognizing that this person is new, that they're not the same as the people who've hurt you in the past, and trying to give them a chance to prove to you that they're not going to hurt you in the same way, but also recognizing that you have to kind of let yourself get hurt, and know that you're strong enough to survive it, that we're not a dependent child anymore. We are now an adult, and we can look after ourselves, and we can survive things in a different way. So that fear is coming from a childhood place, but actually we're an adult now, and that means that even if we do get hurt by someone, like, we'll be okay. And knowing that you have your own back means that you can go into these really vulnerable relationships and be intimate, and take that risk, because ultimately whatever happens, you will be okay. That can take a bit of getting used to, and we might not believe it to start with, but the more we take the risk and the more we trust, the stronger our faith in ourselves gets to pick ourselves up if something goes wrong.
This is a great segue to the next question. How do you trust yourself fully after learning the patterns you have had in your life due to childhood trauma, which has had you going through abusive, narcissistic relationships, which has had gaslight, which have gaslit you so much with so much doubt, etc., in yourself because of that?
Oh, yeah, I really
I
feel the
know.
pain of this.
Yeah.
It's the lack of trust in other people, but the lack of trust in yourself for choosing to let problematic people into your life. And you have to forgive yourself, and that means, again, this word grief that's coming up, like feeling the pain of what's happened to you, and releasing the blame on yourself. And I think it also is about really getting in touch with your intuition. That's not the traumatized part, but the part that knows what's best, and the part that really wants to look after you, because we all have this part, and making that voice stronger, and learning to trust yourself again. Trust yourself to look after yourself and to make the right decisions for yourself. And that can be really hard if you've chosen people in the past who you've thought were great and have ended up really hurting you. So being really cautious, but recognizing that that's not your fault, that you didn't know, and likely whatever was playing out was completely unconscious. So it's like holding yourself to account and trying to be different, but without the shame and without the criticism.
Oh, I felt that one too. David asked, given these patterns are mostly subconscious, what exercises can we do to help identify what they are? I have trouble identifying them in the moment or even in retro.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of catch-22 is that these things are unconscious, that we don't know that we're choosing them until afterwards. And that's why having a therapist is like, there really is nothing to replace another person, because that other person sees so much that you can't see, and can ask the right questions, and can think with you, and like be curious with you, and point things out. And even just say, for example, you're talking about feeling sad, but you're actually smiling. Is that because there's a part of you that's like secretly enjoying the suffering, or are you smiling because you're uncomfortable with expressing sadness? You might not realize that you're doing that, but a therapist sees that and they can point that out, and that's how you become conscious of parts of yourself and things that are happening that you're not aware of. So it is really hard to do on your own. It's not impossible. I think things like journaling, or even just talking to yourself, or analyzing your dreams, or analyzing your responses to people and your triggers and your reactions, all of these things can help us to get conscious after the fact. And then next time we might have a bit more awareness of what's happening in the moment.
I love the next question because it talks about being safe but unhappy. So what if you've been in a safe but unhappy job for so long that it feels like it's too late to change to a new career? And I wonder, like, in what other aspects of our life we can apply that to as well. Like you mentioned, what feels safe isn't usually what's good for us.
No, I mean, it's funny, we live in like this growth culture where you always have to be doing, like, you always have to be changing and improving, and like, in a way, maybe being safe but unhappy is a choice that you make for your life, and you're safe, and like you have like you that might be enough for you, that you feel safe, and you're giving up being super happy in your career in order to feel safe. If that sounds like terrible to you, and you're like, I don't want safety, I want happiness, then take the risk, because you've experienced safety without the happiness. You know what that's like. If you're miserable, you're like, not doing something is choosing misery. And then when we reframe that of like, I'm choosing to be miserable when I don't have to be, um again, it like puts the responsibility in our hands, and I think it then makes change feel a little bit more possible. But again, I would also be really curious as to what it is you're really afraid of in taking a risk of making a change. Like, are you afraid to be happy? Are you afraid to be junior again and to not be top of your game if you're going to be changing career? Are you afraid to learn? Are you what is it? Are you afraid to try and fail? All of these things might be true at the same time, but like really digging into what it is that's holding you back, and why you have those fears. Where do they come from? Who taught you? Where in life taught you to be afraid of those things? And then once you have those answers, again, like putting that into action, and to seeing what happens if you do the thing that's scary. And probably most likely it's never going to be as scary as it is in your mind.
Thank you for that. I know that we said we were going to stay a few minutes longer, so I'm going to ask you one last question because we are past time. Ash asked, how did you differentiate from traumatized intuition and healthy adult intuition?
Excuse me. So I think that traumatized intuition feels more urgent. It feels like I have to act on this right now, otherwise something terrible is going to happen. So it's more of like an anxious, I need to do something. Whereas a kind of grounded intuition is like, I feel like this thing might be going on. Let's get some more information and see what's happening. It's like quite a lot calmer, and it's more reflective and more like a gut feeling. Whereas trauma, I think, can feel very like, stressed and nervous system, and like it's more of a stress and a fear response. So I think it's really confusing, because trauma can feel like intuition, but I often think when we're making a choice that comes from trauma, there's another voice, there's another kind of deeper stomachy gut place that is saying, I don't think this is good for us. I don't think, your intuition is always about your best interest, and the most caring thing to do for you. So I think it's about listening to that voice, even, but the trauma voice is often a lot louder, because it's urgent and it's right now, and it's like, everything's gonna, I'm gonna die if I don't do this, I have to do this. And your your grounded intuition might be quieter, but ultimately it will be there even if it's really quiet and you don't feel connected to it. So it's about like practicing that connection to the quieter voice that has your best interest, and actually like putting that in the driver's seat rather than the trauma intuition.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions, and thank you for taking the time to join us today, Dr. Annie. This was very, very empowering, and this was a really great conversation full of so many insights. For anyone that would love to watch the recording again, I actually would encourage everyone to, because I'm going to watch it again. You can watch the recording on our YouTube channel, Meetup's YouTube channel. And Dr. Annie, thank you so much for joining us today. If anyone would like to purchase the book, we shared the link in the chat. Please go ahead and do so, and have a great rest of your evening, everyone. And thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye.
So much.